Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford, and I am joined today by Captain Luke Amadeus Ranieri, hero of the YouTube channels Scorpio Martianus and Polymathy.
Yep. Hero I don't know about, but those are my channels.
Celebrated for his, your teaching on YouTube of ancient languages, especially Latin, branching out into some ancient Greek, perhaps in the future, and even more. We were talking about earlier, some cool stuff perhaps in the works there.
Right.
And I need you to sell me on something.
Okay.
All right, so,
Is it property? No.
well, you could probably sell me pretty easily on some of this property, but in going through graduate programs in ancient languages, there is a huge discouragement of treating them as living languages. In fact, you can scandalize people by just teaching Gothic using example sentences that aren't in the Gothic Bible.
That's so strange.
No joke, that's actually a real example. Right?
Weird.
The Lambden textbook of Gothic, part of what scandalized teachers of Gothic, huge community, but it is a community, was that he would use sample sentences to teach you inflections and such and vocabulary that weren't drawn directly from the Gothic Bible. This is considered sometimes kind of scandalous. And
Weird.
I'm not the greatest example of this prejudice, but I'm affected by the prejudice, right? I've never spoken Old Norse with somebody, right, except in maybe a very short, jokey context. I haven't produced, literature in Old Norse. Asterisk. Yes, I translated Star Wars into Old Norse. So again, not the best example of purism on the other side of this, but that was a long time ago. And it was kind of a joke. And it was something that I would never talk about in an academic conference. Like, it was very looked askance at by some people around me. Give me the sell, give me the pitch. Why does it make sense to learn ancient languages as active languages rather than as fossils on a page?
Fossil on the page. Much as we like fossils.
Oh, yeah, both of us.
Well, so I'm going to give you the hard sell.
Okay.
As well as talk about it in a more holistic spectrum way, because there's a black and white way to look at it. So I'll take the strong sell first, and then let's talk a little bit about the use of translation or use of grammar-focused approaches, which actually, Familia Romana, which is the introduction to Latin in the Lingua Latina per se illustrata series, is a grammatical textbook primarily. It just changes the order of what it does, and it has, of course, an original narrative. But so the idea is, and the sell here is that, well, we have to look at the goal, because there's different goals. People might actually want to recreate some kind of hypothetical society in which the people are actually speaking said language, let's say Latin. There isn't really not anything like that. But people want to read an ancient language like Latin. And what has been understood through all kinds of papers I'd have to cite through links that we can maybe put in the description of this video, is that to actually do what we understand to be reading, which we'll define here, to do actual reading, you have to have some kind of fluent, to some degree, expressive ability. Now, fluency is not, black or white either. We have varieties of fluent, reading or speaking, writing, and so forth. So all those are different disciplines. But some kind of ability to express oneself with connected forms of ideas which happen exclusively within that language. For example, we can, since we're literate in English, we're able to pick up any book and just read it. But when we think of, usually too, especially in our native languages, is the fact that we can actually read is something that's trained and is something disconnected from the fact that we speak that language already. So let's look at a comparison of, say someone wants to read Dante. Excellent, this is the epic poetry of Dante, the Divine Comedy or something. Let's say they're, a native English speaker. It is possible to learn Italian just through grammar translation, and then to try to, read the language and you get something out of it. However, there's no course that exists that I'm aware of in the world where you can actually just try to actively use grammar translation without first learning basic Italian. Because when you take a basic Italian class, unlike a basic traditional 20th century Latin class, you're just in the latter, you would just be learning grammar translation, working up to be able to read, I don't know, Virgil. But in the Italian class, you're going to learn to be able to have some basic intermediate fluency before you even attempt to approach literature, especially high and difficult literature.
True, true. If I can summarize what I'm taking from what you're saying so far, there's a middle step between that first approach to the language and now you're reading Aristophanes that ancient language instruction often doesn't cover.
Right.
But that modern language instruction often covers, and that is often a very important intermediate step because, for example, I did not have that intermediate step in learning a lot of these languages. Greek, that the Aristophanes, as you know, is a real example.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so that's the sort of the preamble to the introduction which is coming.
All right, well sold.
You didn't ask us to be succinct, did you? But,
I bought this acre. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's sort of the difference of approach. According to the actual studies of how people read, true reading is something which happens when we look at words, obviously, in a sentence, and what it becomes is, in a fraction of a second, an image in the mind that's that story, or whatever information is trying to, if it's visual depiction or a narrative or whatever it is that's happening, and we can see it in our own head. Essentially, that's what true reading is. But what happens is something that's called the phonological. Was it called the phonological loop? There's a term for it which is escaping me now. But what happens is there's this little tape recorder in our head, and it's about 2 to 5 seconds long, if I remember. It's very short.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So what happens is, through reading, we look at words. Those words become instantaneously sound first. So there's this. The words that we read have to become sound, and once they become sound, the brain interprets that sound as if we heard it spoken by somebody, telling us about the fox that was over there, or something. And then we see it in our head, but only because of the sound part.
Interesting. Okay.
And then from that we get an image, and that's what true reading is.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
But this gets me thinking about how, so even when we're reading an ancient language, there's some kind of, even if it's imperfectly formed, aural form to it.
And here's where it happens. Usually, for most of these ancient language instruction and pedagogical systems and frameworks, the sound part is in English because it's based on translation, word for word. Like the way I know it's still pretty strictly taught in Italy to, never do anything until you have a very good Italian translation. That's a normal Italian word order, and that's like that too. And I think in still a lot of English language instruction.
Yes.
You can attest to that. Where you have to have the good English translation, and then you have meaning. So when one learns to read an ancient language that's been taught in this grammar translation way, and the people who've gotten very good at reading it, maybe not the excellent ones, but people are at least decently good at it. So I'd say the majority of professors of, say, Latin or ancient Greek, what they're actually doing is spontaneously translating the phrase into their native language. They hear that, and that's how they get meaning.
So I've seen the difference in presentation here, because surprisingly, I'm actually a quarter of the way to you in terms of how I've taught Old Norse.
Right.
I would always have, so at UCLA, I would always have students, I would say, on whatever day we're going to be reading from this chapter, where we left off last time, so we're going to start there. And I would say, I'm not looking for your written, polished English translation of this. I want you to come in and be ready to read the Old Norse to me.
Right.
Right? Your homework is not to write out that polished English translation. Your homework is to look up the words you don't know. And then you come in and you tell me what that says. But you're going to have to explain to me what's coming out of that.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not asking you to turn it into something you would publish.
Right.
So actually I'm a little bit of the way toward this in terms of thinking about it. Like, I want to see you read Old Norse, not translate Old Norse into English.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that can happen quickly. I know from having had the pleasure of teaching students who had exclusively grammar translation but wanted to learn communicative Latin. So they wanted to take a Latin course, which was taught only in Latin and not using any English at all, or practically none. Lower intermediate levels or even advanced levels. And there are teachers who they frankly knew more about Latin than I do or may ever know, because they've studied about Latin in such detail, but they realized that they wanted to do this thing because they're able to read something relatively slowly. So instead of like, I think it's usually described as, depending on what's published, like a page and a half of whatever, a minute would be, native or normal, say normal, quote unquote, speed, fluent reading speed. But people usually don't get more than a paragraph a minute if they are dependent on even a well-formed and well-practiced grammar and translation way of doing this. So they're getting to English in their head, and they're not writing anything down on paper, but that's what's going on. So these folks, these great folks, were working hard, and it was so hard for them to express themselves because every time they were trying to speak, they had the interference of an automatic, like we were talking about before, the law of primacy. Like it's just their interaction with the language for so many years was English.
Right.
Coming out of that, and they had to keep that from happening and just stay with the Latin and keep with the meaning instead of so when it did become truly fluent, as we are in, say, modern languages, how to get there, and that is really hard, but the benefits are extraordinary, because even diminishing some of that automatic, I would say, interference and probably not helpful when it comes to wanting to be a fluent reader, to get some of that obstacle out of the way, even partially, reaps enormous benefits, because if that person can go from reading 1 to 2 paragraphs a minute, if not, maybe they're not up to the page and a half a minute yet, that change they'll feel and they'll notice, and it'll really improve what they want out of being able to access the literature.
This makes a lot of sense to me, actually, and as I said, it does comport. Surprisingly, I didn't even realize we were going to have this convergence, but it actually does converge with how have been teaching Old Norse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, I see the difference in terms of that, like you said, paragraph or 2 versus page and a half reading speed in people who have learned languages in different ways, and in myself, depending on how well I know a language.
Right.
Right. So if I'm reading a book in Icelandic or listening to the same thing as an audiobook in Icelandic, my pace reading is about the same as the audiobook pace in Icelandic. Right. So that tells me I know Icelandic well. Right.
Yes.
I'm receiving it as Icelandic. I'm not turning it into English because I don't need that extra time.
Right.
But if I'm preparing a video, or perhaps have some other reason to look at some language I don't know as well, and I want to actually do a little bit of reading in it just to remind myself what it's like. This is something I do pretty often. So it's like, say, I'm going to talk about some Ukrainian or Russian. I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to read a little bit of the Bible in Ukrainian or something, right? It's a text that's familiar enough, but I want to just kind of remind myself how Ukrainian works.
Yeah.
That's a slower process because I don't engage with Slavic languages enough that's just like an automatic memory of what this vocabulary is or what this ending is.
And a different alphabet.
Yeah, there's works that are going through there, and it's kind of going through English, so it's a much slower process.
Right.
But I never learned to speak those languages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, that's the idea. So I think that's the basic pitch, that fundamentally for what we truly understand to be reading, we have to, because there's some I know Latin professor types, for example, they from their position, they know the language better than anybody because they wouldn't interact with anybody who speaks it, and they know it really well. They know about it extremely well.
Good mechanics, but maybe not drivers.
Maybe. Yeah, mechanics. I think that's a really good metaphor, mechanics and drivers, maybe, because that's not to...
I'm the lord of stupid metaphors.
You should hear some of mine. Oh, you have. Well, yes, because what I'm doing now is I'm specifically going out of my way at the moment to make sure I don't devalue this, because there was a stage where I was really enthusiastic about comprehensible input, and you can find videos where I said, grammar translation, stop doing that, just do comprehensible input techniques. So now I'm going kind of away from the hard sell and more into the more holistic, and also the devil's advocate, which I like to do now. Like, what's the argument against? And one of them, first of all, which is probably connected with the Gothic or any other ancient or old language that's dead, would be, well, there aren't native speakers, so what's the point? Why are you learning communicative methods when you're going to communicate with whom? With the other students?
Right. What good does it do me to be able to say, what's up in Gothic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would seemingly not a lot. So that, and, are you trying to, like, because it's compared to, like, cosplay or something, and that has a negative connotation for some people.
Well, and very negative connotations inside academia, typically.
Right. Yeah. And some people, some teachers. What's so interesting too, is this. perhaps phenomenon, or I would say it's rapidly becoming more industry standard or approaching, to use communicative Latin and more ancient Greek and Hebrew, more and more. This is happening at greater frequency, at least in North America.
You mentioned Kentucky.
Kentucky. Oh, yeah. Kentucky classics are fantastic there. The great Terence Thunberg and Milena Minkova are the instructors there. They have a master's program that's done entirely in Latin. It's really extraordinary, as well as the summer things.
And then Andrew Bird was spoken Proto-Indo-European.
Yeah.
Something's going on in Kentucky that's kind of cool.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea is the somewhat weakened version, because the strong argument is complete fluency. You can, like, I have great friends who, like Stefano Vittori and Marina Garanin, who've been on my channels, who they speak all the time with each other in Latin, and I speak with them mostly in Latin too, for hanging out with friends speaking Italian, but you don't have to do that wonderful extreme to get almost all of the benefits.
Okay.
So this is the more because the idea of like, oh, it's you don't do cosplay, and the Gothic folks who don't want to disrespect the text by being innovative, right?
I think that's actually a very charitable, and I'm not saying that the way some people sometimes say charitable dismissively. I think that's a kind and charitable way of interpreting that, right? Is that we don't want to disrespect what's there, right?
Yeah.
What if whatever I generate with my modern English speaking instincts out of Gothic looks more like modern English through Gothic clothes, right? It's just, yeah.
Well, it depends what the goal is, because if one is trying to create a something that would be strange or incorrect or even possibly disrespectful, would be to almost create like a forgery of a kind, or it seems like forgery if you create a text that's in Old Norse or Latin or Ancient Greek and say this is as good as or it is more Greek than the Ancient Greek, this is more Latin than Cicero or something like that. Would be a little odd.
I don't know who would say that.
Yeah. No one. Yeah. I think that's sort of the instinctual aversion to something like that. Oh, you're putting yourself on this high pedestal. I don't know. Maybe it's something like that. Maybe someone in the comments can elucidate this. I'm almost coming up with a straw man.
Yeah, it seems like a caricature, but I could see.
Yeah.
But I think it's a caricature that some people believe in.
I think so.
Right. I think to some people, it's like, oh, you think that you can't find enough Gothic in Wolfala. You think you're God's gift at Gothic, right?
Well, when it comes to learning, as you, I'm sure have done in your own classes, and if you've come up with phrases spontaneously in your videos all the time,
yeah.
Or stuff that you prepared for the lesson, where you're like, here is a basic sentence, and you, like in your course on this channel, you have started with basic stuff, and you say we're not going to get into like the hard literature until lesson whatever, you're not going to take too many samples from actual Old Norse. Attested Old Norse, you're going to use simple examples because you need training. And most Latin textbooks are like that. The fact that Gothic people would be so against it is...
Plenty of Old Norse instructors are against it too.
Really?
Yeah, but I mean...
they want the students to learn?
Well...
Well...
Yes and no. And I guess Old Norse is in a slightly weird position because it does have a spoken language that's unusually similar to it today, right?
Yeah.
Not identical, but unusually similar enough that for me to construct a sentence in Old Norse, I feel more confident about than I probably otherwise would, because it's like, this doesn't sound crazy in Icelandic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas I don't have that, for example, with something like Old English or Gothic, if I'm trying to create an example sentence. The closest living languages I have to kind of bounce around, maybe Icelandic, English, German, right? Like,
Well,
there's not instincts that serve as well in something like Gothic or Old English.
Well, here's the thing. When it comes to being able to teach, like there are like texts like Familia Romana, or I'd say to a lesser extent Athenase, they have narratives which are originally written by those authors. And the purpose of them is to start easier and then get more difficult and to incorporate more grammar and vocabulary, ideally in a comprehensible way, which leads to a foundation of the language, so that when little by little in those texts, and eventually a lot, you get original source material, you're ready for it to kind of work up to it.
Right.
So, I just just from it comes from pedagogically, it makes perfect sense to start with something simple and thus prepared by the instructor or by a textbook to help the student get there.
Well, I think Lingua Latina per se illustrata, which I've looked at some, does a very good job of this. Athanase, which I did learn ancient Greek from, does this very well, I think. And it's not as if the authors in either are pretending that, this is attributed to Plato or something. Right? There's no pretense that this is an original text.
Yeah.
This is just like you would find in a modern language text.
Right.
Nobody cares if you're teaching Italian, if you make up some sentences to help them understand,
Well, I care. It's necessary.
Yeah.
Because also with Italian, the objective usually is you have the ability to express yourself spontaneously in original environments.
Right. At least order pizza.
At least order a pizza. La margarita, per favore. Yeah, exactly. That's important. You got to get the good margarita pizza. So when it comes to actually, so we're coming from the strong Gothic argument, the traditional
strong Gothic argument,
the strong, comprehensible input.
Strong Gothic strongman argument.
So I can definitely and confidently, just by looking at other traditional ancient language instruction of the 20th century, and say that not producing simple sentences, at least for comprehension, in a whatever textbook, like say, whatever you can think of which isn't using a narrative, is just common. And like Wheelax Latin, for example, which of course has lots of sentences that are written to help. Here's examples of what the dative case looks like that the author came up with. It's fine.
Right.
And certainly a lot better than trying to take an original text and then not modifying it at all, because then there's problems with it.
Well, then you have to explain 10 more things. Right. The problem there, I think, is actually one of prioritization. Mm-hmm. I want to teach you this thing you're going to see all the time, but it's fairly hard to isolate in its natural environment in Old Norse literature from some much harder stuff that I don't want to deal with yet because you're not going to see it as much.
Yeah.
Right. I want you to know common vocabulary, common grammar things first. Then as you understand that better and you build up some more confidence, then we start talking about some of these complicated, exceptional things.
Exactly.
And if the only example sentences I can find have some of those complicated things that I can't get back to yet, I'm going to have to say, yeah, this doesn't look like a masculine ounce you're used to. Ignore it. That's not the point. And then all I'm doing is discouraging you.
Right.
Right. How much more stuff is there that I haven't?
So, but you teach them not to learn. So you end up teaching them about the thing that you don't want to teach them about yet, by trying to say,
which is pointless.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah. It can be those. It's actually that's one way in which Athanase, for its benefits as being better than, in my opinion, than a traditional grammar translation textbook, severely is lacking, because it frequently, from the very first chapters, introduces vocabulary or grammatical structures. Like the perfect tense is introduced by a vocabulary word that is glossed at the bottom of the page in like the 4th chapter. Mm-hmm. And that happens all the time. You don't get the perfect tense until like the volume 2, until like chapter 20. And so that kind of thing is discouraging. And that's, those might need to happen. And it's still better, but it's good to avoid, because that's the non-comprehensible part.
Right.
Comprehensible through itself as much as is possible with pictures, but glosses into the native language of the reader, that is a crutch, but it's not necessarily what you want to depend on.
I'll mention something else in connection with this. I've noticed that at times when I try to speak a language other than English and other than a Scandinavian language, say I need to speak some Malagasy, that's a real example, it's not English that interferes with my Malagasy. It's Norwegian that interferes with my Malagasy.
Yep.
Right? We tend to have sort of a native language track and kind of a foreign language track, right?
Exactly.
This is a real thing in the human mind, and so often your strongest second language is going to be what interferes more with other foreign languages than your native language does, because it's like, this is other, right?
For me, it's Italian.
Of course, I would absolutely expect that. So what I'm thinking is maybe this way of learning languages helps avoid that problem a little bit more.
It does.
Because
it also helps, yeah.
Because you're not learning one language through another language so much. Because you and I didn't learn English through something else, right?
Right.
As children, we didn't have to be explained, run equals you know, lepa and correre and things like that, right?
Right.
We just have an image of someone running when someone says run.
Right. And when a great example of that being put into practice is the very first lesson that the Polis Institute will do for communicative ancient Greek, which is where the professor has an assistant teacher whom he instructs to stand and to get up and to run and to walk and all these things,
Oh,
and then eventually gets every student to do the same series of commands, like trache, run, or anasterti, stand up,
Cool.
or
Okay.
yeah,
I like the concept. Yeah.
kathison, sit down. And
Good
so,
use of a TA.
good use of those grad students, yeah. And the sitting and getting up, and I've used it a little bit myself. Incredibly fun, and it's also fun because
Yeah, right.
you know, you've rightly said that language learning isn't easy. It's not. It takes hard and consistent daily work, as you've often said. But if so much as that can be made fun or entertaining, in a way that also connecting it to kinesthetic learning can be incredibly advantageous.
Of course.
So let's talk about then all right, so why are you actually trying to learn to speak this ancient dead language or
Yeah.
whatever? How is that actually going to help? So the more normal kind of approach to this is we want to be able to speak in whatever language it is in order to have an ability to express ourselves in order to read better. Now, the reason that works is because we have to have that phonological, I think it's called the phonological loop. This little, we have to get the sound of what we're interacting with into sounds that we are familiar with. So if we're reading, I don't know, a play by a Plautus or whoever, who we see like curre, run, or something, if ideally that has an instinctual thing where I remember when I was playing frisbee golf with, this is actually in Kentucky, Evan, with new friends I had made where we'd only been speaking Latin for days, and they're saying, curre, or something, currite, to multiple people, because we don't have the difference in imperative in English, for example, but we get that in that actual living situation. As soon as we spontaneously read it, we either, one, remember that fun time we had, or that actual physical experience, or unconsciously, the words written on the page are associated with actions that we actually have lived, or can imagine based on some kind of communicative experience, which is why narratives work. So if you read a story like Familia Romana in Latin, like I still remember when I learned certain grammatical things and vocabulary, like to which side of the page it was on that book, because I learned it so well, and I transcribed the whole thing for my own enjoyment. And so I still do associate certain things I do or express myself in Latin with the narrative that I remember.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Well, and often, words in English that I learned later in life, I remember when I learned them.
Yeah.
Right? I'll remember whatever context it was that I first found out what a vole was, for example. Right? Like, I didn't know what this little animal was but I remember the first time I saw one, and I'm like, what's a vole? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I learned it from a fox eating one, but it's like, what's that? Right?
It's probably better than learning it from Quark from Deep Space Nine. But
like you have memories of these things, and you can even have emotions associated with words, right? I think that that's a good indication that you've learned a language pretty well. Is if words. I'm not saying you're going to weep when you see a page of Latin. I'm saying, are you going to see a word and it actually makes you think about, like when you see lightus, do you think about being happy?
Yes.
Right? In the same way that you do when you see English happy, or do you have to think about happy first?
No, I immediately think of happy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a pretty big step. Or when you see, run, do you think of your legs moving? When you see hat, do you think of, something on your head, right?
Right.
That I think is a pretty good indication that you've learned.
Yeah.
That much more fluently.
It's kind of emotional anchors and I guess maybe narrative anchor might be a term for it. I'm sure there's some
narrative
technical
anchor
term
sounds pretty good.
Because personal narrative of your own life or your own experiences or experiences you got from watching TV. Like I have so many situations and things I learned about from The Simpsons or whatever in life that I still remember to this day. As,
yeah, me too. Same generation.
Yeah, exactly. And so that
Oregon Trail.
Oh yeah. So those kinds of so having those kinds of connections, because it comes to ultimately, if we want to isolate the reading part down to eyes looking at words without struggling, instantaneously turning them into subconscious sound, which is done through reading aloud and also being read too. That's why I make all the audiobooks I do on my audiobook store and for my patrons on Patreon in Latin and Ancient Greek, in order to because I make them for myself, and then I'm able to share them with others, and then to get that listen to them and have that repeated, that helps to make the reading of it so much easier.
And by the way, I think those are the best kinds of educational materials, the ones we make for ourselves,
Yeah.
right? I made this understandable for myself, so now perhaps it'll help you understand.
Yeah.
We are, after all, our own first students.
That's right. And but though it's also worth noting that we can also have our own biases.
Course,
I swear I have a Famiglia Romana to learn Latin. I think it reaches the most people. But I have worked with students for whom it doesn't work that great.
Sure.
And there are other things they need. They might need something that's way more kinesthetic. Something like Famiglia Romana appeals to people who like reading. Because if you don't like reading, if you absolutely hate it, or it doesn't matter if you're literate or not, you can be perfectly literate, but just not be a reader of any kind.
True.
You probably would benefit more from a full immersion in a classroom spoken Latin experience.
Sure. Yeah.
Everyone could probably get some benefit out of that. But what about people who are shy, who are being forced in ancient Greek to run and walk and stand on top of the chair because the instructor's telling them to do so?
Yeah,
I love that.
But it's embarrassing for some people, and
it's extremely embarrassing.
Yeah,
that can be helpful too, because if you in small amounts, getting over a little bit of embarrassment, in general, is empowering. Especially if you get the benefit of getting the power of learning, an ancient language too. That's pretty cool.
But you also don't want to take somebody who's just naturally shy and just dump them into a situation.
For some people, it can be crippling,
Yeah.
and I don't think people need to have their inherent personalities challenged by a pedagogical experience when there might be another one that's correct for them. So that's this is I guess a strong argument or weaker version of this pitch. The weaker, and I think more, I wasn't looking for, not holistic, but the more, I guess holistic's fine enough. The holos, the whole
organic,
the biological, the
carbon neutral.
There you go. We'll stick with the carbon. The sort of different approaches is that I know for myself as a teacher, I've had to modify my passionate approval of certain things like Famiglia Romana and realize this might not work for someone, or this student or this group of students is not going to. They're going to need some English explanation.
Right.
Or a lot maybe, and it's because it's too hard. Like I've taught Famiglia Romana in just 2 months with some. Unfortunately, they're wonderful students, but they had dedicated themselves to learning in 2 months. I learned the thing in 3 months, and that's pretty fast. You can learn that fast, and some people can't actually do it that quickly. But I needed to use a lot of English to let them know what was really going on in this, because it was just too quick.
It's still an auxiliary. I mean, if you're still primarily using Latin,
at least the text is, But some people are and I get their opinion. I used to be of the same opinion entirely, that all Latin all the time for the instruction. Don't use any other things. But it also takes a lot of training, because if we're to be able to reach all those students, the shy ones, the non-reader types, whatever we have in a classroom, we have to use.
And by the way, this is all still assuming the students want to be there.
Assuming they want. That's right. Oh gosh.
Which
high school or something. Yeah.
Heck, even in college, yeah.
Exactly. So they have to want to do. They have to want to do it. So being able to, if you're going to go for a full-on immersion experience, well, the teacher's probably going to have to be pretty good at expressing themselves in the language. To say it's Latin. So, but it doesn't mean you can't use something like Famiglia Romana and teach it with using a minimum of the native language, and just kind of stick to the questions that are in there. There's questions and answers in the teacher's manual, so a teacher could go through it without actually being able to speak and still give their. That's interesting too, because now teachers who can't speak very well but try really hard because of years of experience at grammar translation, they'll never be able to speak, but they're students, because they use these materials, end up becoming better at it because they don't have years of a different training method to fight against.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So thus, what does this bring us back to? Because this definitely to target this more on, say, I don't know, Old Norse or on any other language besides Latin and Greek where this has been tested very much. We don't have, as far as I know, as much attested Old Norse. We have a modern language which is really similar. So there's a lot of attested, like how do you say things in Icelandic to compare it to. So
there's a good sized corpus of Old Norse. The Old Norse corpus is a lot bigger than I think people realize. Yeah,
no.
there's it's not just fiction. There's also nonfiction.
Okay.
There's a lot of medieval clerical works. There's medieval geographies and even alchemies and things like that. There's
So if you want to have I don't know, compare it to say the wonderful Conventiculum Latinum in Kentucky, for example. That is 8 days, full immersion. You have a couple head instructors, some assistant teachers, and up 60 to 90 participants who all sign something too. They're only going to speak Latin with each other. Only if they're in a restaurant or something or whatever out in town would they be, of course, permitted naturally to speak English.
Are
But,
they? Is there? Are they punished for speaking English?
no, it's just you sign a jus jurandum, you sign a little oath to do it because they want everybody to take it seriously because they
Right.
know because if a participant speaks to another participant in say English during that time period, they're taking away from their advantage to have a consistent immersion thing, which is
Yeah.
exhausting.
Right. And what did you pay for?
That's what you paid
yeah,
for, right?
yeah.
So I'm just to sort of ask this question: does there exist enough Norse material to be able to create enough using whatever is necessary from Icelandic, of course, as an auxiliary? Is there enough material to have a reasonably authentic, full immersion, week-long experience like that, where you're looking at Old Norse text? That's your objective. But there's also lunches together. There's also dinners together, and you make conversation about whatever. Is there enough that exists?
You could do it.
You can do it. Well,
Yeah.
hey, there we go. That's good news.
You could do it. I mean, of course, the big question that I think comes up is why.
I will answer that. Good. I was hoping you were going to say. Why would you do that? To be able to create groups at one cohort at a time of people who can read fluently the language. They can pick up the prosetta or whatever, and they can just read it as if they're reading. Not necessarily as good as say if they're English speakers English, but if they know another modern language, at least that good. Just as we teach ourselves to be able to speak in modern languages, if we want to read them, to be able to read them better. So that's the idea. So.
Right. So the why it's a means, not an end. Right.
Right. Because
Yeah.
if people want to use it as an end to do, they want to live their lives speaking mostly Latin, or almost entirely, or they want to create a community or cosplay or whatever revival thing they want to do. I mean, that's fine, but that's not my personal goal, and it's not what most people want to do, I think.
But I think that's actually part of the resistance to this idea in academia, is that it seems like an end.
Right.
Right. There's so much effort that's put into it, and it can seem kind of gimmicky to people, right?
Mm.
Like, oh, great, you're talking about the French fries you liked in Latin or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And they see it as an end. Like, what
Of course, this isn't new. I mean, all the way through. Like, one of my favorite books is by Pontanus. I did some audiobooks of, not just Pontanus, but Scotenius. Schotten was a teacher in Cologne, and when he was in his 20s, he wrote this amazing set of dialogues and conversation that they teach for, like, because when students would get to, these are private institutions in the 1600s in Cologne, Germany, and they were like 8 years old when they got there. They had to already speak Latin with basic fluency, and this because they already got tutored at home to be able to do it, so that they could take this career. So by the end, they they were as fluent in and literate in Latin as they were in German or whatever else they could speak.
It's hardcore.
Because the international language was still Latin. You to do anything
Right.
At that high academic or professional level, there had to be a strong Latin ability. So, to the point where it was severely punished in a kind of German academic way, which is they could be quite severe, to speak German. You had to speak Latin in that situation entirely. Now, I'm not for draconian kinds of at all punishing students for
Anacondian punishment.
anacondian punishments for that kind of thing, because I think it's counterproductive. But this has happened hundreds of years ago.
Right.
This is a revival movement, not an original let's speak Latin because it's good thing. This is a bringing back the basics, I would say.
I mean, total side note, if you did say you were running a Latin camp and you were going to beat people who spoke English, I mean, you'd get customers. People would be...
Maybe.
There's people who are into that.
Fieri potest. Do not honesty. Yeah, it's possible. Could be. So that's the pitch. There is strong evidence in the form of research papers about how we actually learn language. Because another counter argument, which to what you said before, was that we learn English without an intermediary language as native speakers.
Right.
But as adults, we don't learn any languages like that. So a lot of people in academia and ancient languages, especially if they're Anglophones, don't have own experiences learning other languages. And because of that, they might think that fluent reading, is getting to the point of spontaneous translation, so you hear your own English translation in your head and then they're reading. And they're not even consciously aware that that's what's going on.
Right. I so often encounter that understanding.
Yeah. And that, so they don't
even in
necessarily
academia.
have a lot right.
Yeah.
So usually a lot of people who take to this are people who have some decent fluency in another language. If they're Anglophones like myself, I knew Italian first. So I'm like, of course I've learned to speak Latin. Why would I not? It never occurred to me not to until I realized how unusual it was, which came later. So my own ignorance and innocence helped there.
I guess it's interesting. I mean, my language biography is pretty different from yours in that way, because I did a lot of ancient languages before I ever tried to learn any living language. Huh.
Yeah.
I wonder, but it's odd because it almost seems like the way that I've approached these things would suggest that wasn't my background, right? Because I don't try to learn languages and try to produce finished translations. Of course, I do produce finished translations, available wherever books are sold.
That's right.
But but it's not my goal when I'm reading. I want to just read it in whatever the original is, right? And that's what I'd like to teach too. And now I'm trying to figure out where I got that idea, because I've thought about it that way for a long time, and it's not how I was taught any of these languages.
No.
I mean, but of course I'm self-taught in a lot of these languages. So
that's part of self-teaching leads to this. I think that kind of thinking perhaps as well, because you don't necessarily depend on an inveterated pedagogical framework.
That's a good word, inveterated. I mean, I had a great Latin teacher in high school who had kind of an infectious affection for Latin, like you, not at your level. I mean, you bring so much cheer and exude so much cheer about it, right? But she was kind of similar, like kind of a similar love for the subject, like legitimate, right?
Yeah.
And I think in trying to communicate that, she maybe sparked some of this. I mean, actually, she would have us write stuff in Latin sometimes.
That's great. I mean, Wheelock's Latin teaches you to do that as well.
But we didn't use Wheelock. We just used, basically, it was like her curriculum.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, Mrs. Miller. I have no idea whatever became of her, but maybe she's out there high. She probably doesn't remember me, but
Saturday.
well, she's Solway. I don't know. She's out there, I guess. Yeah, I'm trying to remember how on earth I came to think about these things the way I do.
Yeah, because I think it's just so much enjoyment to be had. There's enjoyment in the process too, like the fun of the partial cosplay-ishness of, say, forcing yourself to live a whole academic reading-focused experience, but with no English during those 8 days with anybody. Like and by the way, not just that one. That's just one of the oldest in the U.S. and one of the most famous. Oh, nice red-tailed hawk.
It's close.
Yeah. Hopefully it gets on the mic.
It's a word we say differently.
Yes. Cod merger?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it's pretty close. How do you say it?
Hawk.
Oh, it's quite open. Or quite unrounded, I guess.
Yeah.
Because I should be in the same position, just hawk. Just leave it a little bit more rounded.
Yeah.
Hawk.
Well, this is a big difference between our accents.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's true.
I was just thinking about that because I listened to your IPA video. Where are you? Oh, you know what I think this is?
Yeah.
Boy, this is wandering afield. I think this is a Stellar's Jay imitating a red-tailed hawk.
Really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
I see the Stellar's Jay. So I think the Stellar's Jay wants us to move and is trying to scare us, right?
That's adorable.
I'm going to come eat you. They do this sometimes.
Birds are great.
I got some peanuts for you, Stellar's Jay, I promise. I do. I carry for just this occasion. Anyway.
Yeah, so the...
do you see him?
Yeah.
The bright blue, bright dark blue? That almost doesn't sound like it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
See what I'm talking about?
I do, yeah, right there.
Yeah, I think he's the one making the hawk sound.
We're on to him, and he's gotten quiet.
Yeah, buddy.
So, what was the element I was talking about? The idea of immersion or the fun of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the utilization of a narrative for experiences that you can latch onto, which is exactly how we learn languages. That element of fun is helpful, but it can be either your own experiences or experiences of characters that are fictional or real or whatever, in order to be able to attach that to something. Because when it's quite abstract, it can't be easy. Human beings, when we learn about anything, like history, for example, history can be analyzed, dissolved into little pieces of dates and facts. But when there's a story which connects arcs and elements together, it makes it a lot more interesting.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I've told you very much about my biography reading project.
Tell me.
But it's a similar thing, right? So I decided at some point a couple years ago, boy, it's a shame I just never had a good American history class. I thought to myself, I'm going to teach myself American history. But how I'm doing it is I'm actually just reading biographies in chronological order. I mean, people's lives overlap, but as chronological as one can get.
That's a really good idea.
So I'm reading all of the presidents.
Mm-hmm.
And
Grant's a good stage. You gotten up to Grant?
I have. Most recent president I've done is Garfield.
Wow.
And this is a 2-year project, so I've been really diving deep.
Fluent.
I know. He was
in Latin and Greek
classics
and ambidextrous. You could do it right above.
Classics professor. I think the only classics professor in the Oval Office. But of course, I'm not reading it for the presidents. The presidents are just kind of my scaffolding.
Yeah.
And then I read people's lives that where the important events overlap with whatever president. So I spent a long time in the Civil War. I'm doing a lot of Old West stuff, things like that. But anyway, the reason I'm doing biographies is because one person's life story is a story.
That makes sense. I mean, the way we consume what's the last time there was a story in TV or film that wasn't about characters, or especially one character? The story of whoever, Luke Skywalker, what is. Right. Yeah, it's iconic and relatable. Right. Because that's how it's structured.
But it's so much easier to remember, like, I remember the time that, I remember so vividly Grant elevated to the officer corps again after his time as just basically a loser about our age in Galena, Illinois, right? Working his dad's shop.
That cabin,
yeah. Like, that's a emotional, if you will, memory in a way that it wouldn't be just, you go through a book about, all about the Civil War. And it's
right.
And at this point, Grant won Vicksburg.
Man.
Right? It's more interesting to live it through people's eyes.
Right.
And interesting to see the same story through different people's eyes.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's also why I really I really appreciate film and cinema like you do, like good stories or making fun of when they're really badly written. But the good literature that exists is mostly good because, like, literature that we have preserved is therefore very good.
Of course.
For the most part. These poetry or narratives or epics or whatever they are, from antiquity, from modern times.
Everything from Prometheus Bound to Breaking Bad. Is character driven.
And I think that's really important, and this is less language based as an argument, but I just think it's good and naturally important to humanity. It's like to be able, because we can, thanks to literature, people were able to, you learn so much, and when it adds things to a person's character by reading those things. And now, of course, we have other forms of literature, and I think of good TV and good, like, say, Breaking Bad, or good film as literature in a sense, because people had to write in particular.
Right.
And by having those, we get to, or through absurd comedies like The Simpsons, we get to really, we have to live partially in a vicarious way lives of others, which then help to expand, like, oh, I want to do that, oh, I don't want to do that, I want to do this with my life, I don't want to do that. I think that it can be really, it has an enormous value. So when people might say that, say, TV or film is suffering in some respects, and say people say that about a lot of film and movie that's come out in the last decade. Plenty of good ones. There's some real like losers, really terrible kind of things that are not only are not consistent with the norms of good literature or good movie making or that, but they actually are counterproductive, and to help people think about how to interact with the world, and not even in a specific, like, oh, you should say or think this or whatever, but just that, they don't, and I don't want to do any specific examples because there's too many to go into now, but it's that's why I think that it is something valuable, that because when I don't complain about this too much publicly, but when it comes to some, like, really bad incarnations of some franchise or something, and it just doesn't at all live up to that. Others people can get really upset, not because well, it's just a film. Like, yeah, but it's trying. There's this something that's really important that
Right.
this story, at once before the modern rendition or the sequel or whatever was providing, and that if you put them all together, it's like this doesn't measure up at all. And
Right.
so anyway, I think that's
It's-
just important to humanity to have good stories.
In those cases, it's failing to say something true that
Mm.
was said so well in the original.
Right.
And actually, I think that this is a key part, if I may, of your argument,
Please.
which is that to share these experiences with another person, nonfiction or fictional, whether reading a journal by some historical figure or reading the great tragedies of ancient Greece, sharing a language makes sharing those experiences all the more real.
Yeah.
If I don't have to borrow it into my language.
Right. Right, to access it in the original as much as possible.
Right. Who is it, Ennius, who said he had 3 hearts
I think it was.
because he knew Latin, Greek, and Oscan?
Yeah. Oh,
Right.
to know Oscan. Too bad that wasn't preserved. Darn. But it is partially, but
Some.
not extensively.
Um,
Yeah.
But I think that it's I think you could probably go over the top with being sentimental about it, maybe. But I think that the bit about 3 hearts, there's something beautiful about that, right? Like I don't have to. It doesn't all have to pump through the same heart.
Different
Right.
ventricles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And hey, I mean, something that I've encountered in Old Norse, and this can sound pretentious, but like I don't know a lot of Old Norse literature in translation because
Right.
I've read it in Old Norse.
I know essentially no Latin literature and translation.
But do you find it weird when you encounter something you know real well in the original in translations like this?
Yeah.
It's kind of weird.
I suddenly interact with it that way, and then it could be interesting or helpful because you get stuff from the translator. Also, there are usages which might be obscure because they mean something very specific, and that translator was able to do their homework and find out, oh, this usage
Sure.
of this or that
Sure, of course,
is
yeah,
relatable. But
yeah.
I remember too, I was looking recently at some of the eclogues, and I was trying to think of some specific example, but it's not coming to me. But the professor in this course I was seeing was just glossing over completely something that was utterly plain. Like there was a kind of subtly obscene metaphor that was in there.
So just ignoring it.
It's just ignoring it, either deliberately because maybe the person was embarrassed, which is fine, or probably not even noticing it. But my opinion of it was that, like, I think this is vital to what the author's trying to tell, and it's not to be skipped over. A good example of
Tell me that Roman poets sometimes had dirty minds.
yeah, they did, exactly. So there's a kind of it's interesting because we need in some way to get into the mindset of some of these ancient peoples, but the thing that some people might be displeased by, where from our perspective, horribly, maybe even unvirtuous from our perspective, or immoral ways that people conducted themselves in the past. Name your ancient civilization, you'll find things that are
course.
horribly reprehensible by our standard.
But it's not our
even by
time,
their
it's not our
time.
place. There's no crime to redress now, right? So I
Yeah.
mean, learn from it. Perhaps
Yeah.
take the skeptical viewpoint and let it make its case for whatever. Aristotle. There's that Stellus J. I swear it's the J. Aristotle says the mark of the educated mind is the ability. Yeah, I see him. To entertain an idea that he doesn't accept.
Exactly.
That's absolutely what the J is doing.
Yeah. That's awesome.
I've got peanuts for you. Give me a minute.
Yeah. So
I've managed to make more classical allusions in this video than you have.
Oh, so
Not-
false.
Not that you're. Yeah, well, yeah. I'm so sophos.
Yeah.
Not that you're incapable. I'm just trying to keep up. Is what it is, right?
Oh, you yeah. I could just try to give up with you. Well, so just as far as the topic of this conversation, is it worthwhile to attempt to learn whatever ancient language in a communicative way? It certainly can be, and a lot of, I think, I would say, if you have an interest in one of these languages and you want to, if you feel an urge to express yourself, maybe you want to try to keep really simple journal entries, and maybe like something that's also Oh, I know what I'm talking about. Before this, I was just reminding myself of is doing it badly. What if you're trying to, like when I was starting to learn Latin, I kept Latin journal entries, and I still kind of do from time to time. And and they're terrible. What I was doing before, my grammar was off, my vocabulary usage, because I didn't know yet. I didn't know better, but it framed me. It gave me the experience I needed to. It gave me the experience I needed to prepare for the next thing. So if we get Gothic sentences that are bad Gothic, in order to learn Gothic, it's okay. And another example, an ancient one I can think of, are the Hermeneumata or the Interpretamenta by, we actually don't know who wrote them, but there was a pedagogical book with all kinds of conversational situations, and it was Latin and Greek. Latin on one side, Greek on the other. It was had different purposes, and there were different codices which have different versions of these manuscripts. But it was used by some to learn Greek, and it was used by Greeks to learn Latin. And you could use it both ways, and I've used it myself. So there's some parts where it's clear that the Greek is imitating the Latin, or it's other times the Latin is imitating the Greek. So you see things that aren't really good of one or the other language.
Interesting.
So you might not want to actually express yourself, because you're not, you can have, like having word-for-word translations, like I think I've seen, you do even sometimes, right? And to teach with.
And explaining, right.
Right.
But that's also part of, when I do word-for-word translations, it's not for offering that as the English, it's for helping you understand the original.
Exactly,
right?
and that's the purpose of it. So,
yeah.
But the idea, though, is if you have a really, like a translation of something from English that you know, that you read or understand, and next to it, or even without the English, that's really Englishian syntax, and you read the Latin that way. Or you're going to get vocabulary. You'll get grammatical stuff. You're not going to get syntax, but you can get all these other things at the same time. So you're prepared for going to something where you do have all the verbs at the end, or many of the verbs at the end, instead of the verb in the second place. Now, I don't think that particular crutch is necessary to learn Latin with. In fact, it's probably better to kind of think of, okay, verb always at the end. Also with ancient Greek, but ancient Greek usually doesn't have the verb as end as much as Latin, and Latin doesn't have it at the end more than like 50% of the time anyway.
Right.
So, but that kind of thing. So learning something where, because Famiglia Romana I know is actually detested, even by people who speak Latin well or teach with communicative methods.
Detested.
Yeah, they absolutely don't like it at all, because they see it as having produced bad Latin, because the first chapters are, like, Marcus est filius Julii, Marcus is the son of Julius.
But you got it.
It's like too simple, or it's not using...
If you're learning to paint, you have to paint badly before you can paint well.
And that's the idea.
I mean, I just don't understand. I've encountered this so much. I remember I was on the bus in Iceland once, and I sat next to this lady, and we got to talking, and she was Polish, and it manifested somewhere along here that she understood Icelandic perfectly well.
Nice.
Right? And I said, well, I don't hear you speaking any Icelandic, right? She's speaking to the person taking the tickets or whatever in English and talking to me in English and all that. I said, well, I speak Icelandic. Yeah, but I know I can't do it right. And I said, who cares? I mean, yeah, Icelanders aren't very used to hearing people who aren't native speakers speak Icelandic. They can be pretty judgmental. They can switch to English pretty fast. But you're never going to learn if you don't try.
Yeah.
And, of course, you also have to be a little bit willing to embarrass yourself, which some people can't even do in the privacy of their own, locked room.
Yeah.
Right? It can be hard to look at something that only you will ever see and say, I know this isn't perfect, let alone to do it in front of other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, I'm not perfectly shameless, but I know that I'm a ridiculous person that will be mocked and lambasted no matter what. So why not just, speak some bad Icelandic?
It does help, even for the shy people out there. I would say if you're able to, whatever it is required to put yourself out there, if it's in the classroom, if it's in the real world, to learn a language. If if you're stuck between, I don't want to go, you're living in the country and you don't want to go order something or go to a store because you're going to have to use the language because you're embarrassed, I'd say, don't worry, try what you can.
Right.
But, I also understand them not wanting to. The cultures matter too.
Yeah, and Icelandic is a little bit different in that way.
The cultures of the people that you're trying to talk with. Are they used to? Do they like it?
Right.
Like, are they, say,
right.
the strong version of the negative would be, say, French and to a lesser extent Germans. French usually, and then usually, and this is just a stereotype, so that's what I'm talking about now, are stereotypes. There are plenty of examples of the contrary. French stereotype is they don't really want you to mess up their language.
Yeah, right.
So, I get it. I understand purism as an idea when it comes to language, and I'm not saying it's completely invalid. One of the reasons Latin is preserved is because people thought the same thing about Latin and preserved it.
True.
So, so I get there's some motivation there. Another would be Germans, where it can be, depends on what kind of people you're dealing with, but very frequently you might be conversing in German. I don't know if you had this experience with speaking German. They'll correct you. And from our perspective, Americans or say Southern Europeans tend not to do that a lot. And I find that happens in general with I love Germans and German culture. German language was the first language I learned as a foreign language was German in college, or no, in high school and middle school. And but when it comes to talking about whatever, they might be quick to correct you. I've seen this too in interviews where you have like a German guy on a panel or something. Like he'll correct like the littlest detail. And from my perspective, I think, oh, that's kind of weird.
Right. When's the last time?
For them, it's normal.
Right. When's the last time you did that with somebody who didn't speak English as a native language? I feel bad if I heard somebody say gooses and I said geese. Right.
Well, who wouldn't probably most of the time would be usually Japanese or Italians. They tend to be so thrilled. I'd say Japanese especially are just shocked when someone who's not Asian is speaking their language with any kind of fluency, which is something I had a lot of fun with.
And Italians too, you say?
And Italians, they can, and it could be different. I think that's because there's two arguments. There's either it's better to get corrected by saying geese, not gooses, or there's the fact that if I interrupt you in the middle of your discourse, and this has also been demonstrated linguistically in actual pedagogy, like if you correct the student or the person who's just trying to communicate, it discourages them. And these little micro ways that build up within they're not wanting to express themselves.
Every time I open my mouth, someone tells me what I'm doing wrong. Yeah, right.
Yeah, even though they don't mean anything about it, even if they're really nice about it, even if they're in the teacher position and not just some friend or whoever that you're speaking with in that language. So it's interesting that kind of.
So you're right. And then
I don't know if I'm right, but I've heard
but you're right. This sort of thing happens. I've seen it. And then in Icelandic, it's like, you weirdo, why are you trying to speak Icelandic?
So you have to push through a lot of resistance for Icelandic. I always wanted to.
It's like so bizarre. Like obviously there's exceptions. Like I'm talking about stereotypes, but it's kind of a stereotype from my own experience. Like, why?
Yeah.
What's this for?
Yeah.
Like,
and it's culturally different too, because if we have, like I'd say, at least American culture, when we deal with foreigners, I don't know if I've ever actively corrected someone in this country who came and was just speaking English.
Yeah.
That doesn't occur to me to do that.
Whereas I've been mocked on Icelandic national television.
Oh no, you were? I know you're on it. I know you were mocked though.
No, I did a section once. Right afterward, the main anchor just kind of looks at the screen, and is like,
"Oh my god!"
Like, okay, great. I don't actually know what I'm being mocked for.
Look at this guy for especially speaking a language that's not.
But
it's
I mean,
hard without there's.
It's actually kind of a general Scandinavian thing. It's like, why are you learning this language? We all speak English, right? Like, this is pointless.
Well, here's the
language
here's the
is
dang
pointless.
answer. Not you, Jackson, but the world out there who's representing this argument is because we can understand and appreciate the culture better, the living one and the ancient one. That's why. That's why this is not something. It's not weird to learn Swedish or just because every
Swedes are probably the least.
Are they
culpable of this in
I
the
don't
Scandinavian
know.
context?
I know Swedes speak excellent English often, or Danes or Icelanders.
I think it happens least in Swedish because Swedish being the largest population, like there's a little bit more encounters with people who learn Swedish as a second language.
And the reason is to interact with the culture and to appreciate it, and it can go so far. Maybe it shouldn't be that a foreigner in whatever country speaking that language is more readily embraced. Maybe that's not fair, but I know from personal experience that just making the effort to try. I remember speaking French in Geneva, in Switzerland, and even though I did it with an accent, I did it badly. Unlike the French stereotype, French-speaking Swiss tend to be quite welcoming, and they tend to really like it, and so that it can really go a long way. And so I think it.
Same in Quebec, I thought.
I've never been. Yeah, that'd be cool.
It's the only French-speaking place I've ever been to. So.
Yeah.
People were pretty, they're happy that I tried speaking French with them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So I think there's whether it's an ancient language or a modern one, and we want to have a meaningful relationship. It sounds a little bit too psychology. Meaningful relationship with the literature, where we're getting more out of it. There, if you are able to express yourself to some degree, you will be able to passively absorb written or heard material from it.
Yeah,
that's my.
There's a plasticity to your understanding of it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
It's not so rigid. If it's only what you've received, then you might be fairly limited in what you're adaptable to receiving.
Yeah.
You know, I mentioned early on in this conversation about how long ago in grad school I translated Star Wars into an Icelandic saga.
Yeah.
And it's not just the language, but also the whole story is turned into what it would be as an Icelandic saga.
Right, you
it's
altered
not
also
space.
Culturally, not just it was localized to the culture, not just translated.
It's actually set in the 900s in the North Sea and stuff.
To be like the true original that it was based off, like that
that was my joke, and some people still believe that actually, which is pretty great. But it helped me understand Old Norse better. As embarrassed as I can be about that project, I have to say that the actual original intent of it, which was to help me know Old Norse better for my prelims for my PhD, I was kind of successful at that, because I'd had to think about, well, how does one say this in Old Norse, right? In a way that I had never had to think of it before. Now, I'm pretty sure if you had told my advisor about that then or now, she would be not just surprised that I had done that, but like horrified that I'd done that, right?
So funny.
And I think that's a pretty common attitude in a lot of academic circles about ancient languages. And I mean, I'm slightly embarrassed about it because it's Star Wars. I don't know why. There's a whole long story behind why I did it. That's stupid, but
what a great exercise! What a great way to prepare.
It was an exercise. It was a good exercise. Yeah.
You know, it's not like that's the purpose. Probably the greatest value of the purpose for you was it gave you the plasticity to approach all kinds of texts that are original in ways that you might not have been able to do as readily without that experience.
Well, and then look at something this isn't perhaps as relevant an example, but something like your cowboy eclogues or my cowboy Hávamál, taking something in an ancient language and communicating it by the visual language or the language itself of another culture. There's, I think, some real understanding value there.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think that if someone were to rewrite saga as a Western, you would actually learn a lot about the saga genre from doing that. And I guess there's an argument, which Taylor Booty has made, that Django Unchained is basically the Volsunga saga.
Which makes sense given that all the references to Wagner that are in there.
I think it's almost too mediated by Wagner to be Volsunga saga, but yeah, it's got a lot of Volsunga's elements in it. Yeah,
sure.
But I think that you could actually learn a lot about both genres by doing that. And no, I'm not going to do it because the creative part of my soul is dead.
Oh, no. There's a little bit in there. There's a little spark.
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation. I've gotten a lot out of it, and as far as you selling this to me, what surprised me in having this conversation and the depth that we did is I realized I had already bought a lot of this without realizing what I bought. You know what I mean? Like, I hadn't quite realized that I had actually been teaching in a way that approaches some of this living language instruction.
Yeah.
And you've helped me maybe start to step over some of the embarrassment that I might have about being more, introducing more conversational Old Norse into teaching Old Norse, right? Because it's not an end. This isn't me LARPing, right?
Right.
Which, like a lot of people of an academic background, there are a few things that sound that make me more duck for cover than the accusation of LARPing. It's about that being a means to the end of better understanding.
Right.
And and I like that notion of the sort of plasticity of the mind that's encouraged by producing and not just receiving in a language.
That's why for me too, I'd want to, really any language, ancient or modern I'd approach, I want to kind of feel what basic conversation or some way of expression is like in that language and be able to reproduce it at some level. Like if you happened in the future to ever teach me some ability to express myself in Old Norse in a conversational way, whether it was just hi or how are you or whatever it is. And then that I know from my own experience, having done it in other languages, would make me a better reader.
Mm-hmm.
And for the excitement, enjoyment of it, but also for the personal connection that it brings. So I do advocate it. But this is also not to say grammar translation is bad. It's not. It has a purpose, especially for people who want to learn translation, which I have come to respect a lot, especially more recently. As
It's its own art.
It's its own art. It's not without value. It can be separated completely from learning a language. Like a lot of people learn modern languages without ever learning to properly translate anything, the way a true translator like yourself does or would do.
If I'm a true translator, there's like
yeah,
true detective.
You're trained to do it, and you have
not actually trained to do
published books, which are fantastic, which demonstrate an example of this specific art or ars, skill that I mean to say, techne. And so the this is a be interesting for a different topic. The pretentiousness of throwing in foreign words into a conversation, and is that even valuable, or are we pushing people away? I think that's something that's worth bringing up at a different.
I've always appreciated the elan with which you present.
Sehr gut.
You're very adroit, right? Yeah. Now, I do have a particular way I want to conclude this conversation for those who have sat with us through all of this. Do you put out your videos as podcasts or anything too? Like it's just audio?
So I have.
So many people seem to want that. This kind of conversation would probably work well that way. But
as a podcast, yeah, it's interesting because any podcasts that are out there, even though I have the podcast app, I usually prefer watching it through YouTube.
Oh.
Anyway, just because I don't know, I find the interface a little bit faster and.
Yeah. But I mean, if you're driving or something, I've thought about it, but it's like, man, you know how little time I have.
Well, I've done podcasting before a little bit with a podcast I made with my friend Jesse Kraft. We speak only in Latin together, and it's
kind of fun.
He's a teacher. He hasn't had any time to continue this past year because of with teaching and COVID and all those things. So it's been super difficult. And I'm sure he'll have time to come back to it. Not that I've been super available either, so it's been fine. Right. But the biggest difficulty I found is that you have to pay so much money as the podcaster, like a lot of money, just to have it available to a moderate-sized audience. So
that was just a side thought.
Yeah.
The way I want to conclude this. All right. You see the timestamp there?
Yeah.
1:13:20. By 1:14:20, I want to hear your stanza in Latin on this vista, this Rocky Mountain vista.
And that's descriptive of it.
Yeah. I don't know. Give me something. Evoke this in
Latin. Okay. Yeah.
I want to see your Latin on the fly. You got...
Let's actually something original or something quoted?
I want to hear your original thoughts.
Utego describam id quod video.
Yeah.
To describe that which I see.
Yeah.
I translate spontaneously.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah.
Itaque post nos hic sunt montes vulgerrimi montium saxosorum, the Rocky Mountains. Videmus nivem quae cacumina horum montium operit et cum ego haec video permoior.
I'm impressed. No, well, I think I got it, but sure, give us a translation.
Oh yeah, just talking about seeing the snow on these mountains and how beautiful and lovely it is. I'm deeply moved.
Well, it's an honor to have you here in Colorado. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about living in ancient languages. I think that's what I'll title this. And, Luke Ranieri, pleasure.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you.
And everyone out there, from beautiful Colorado, we're wishing you all the best.